Okay, so I think we're going to get started. I just wanted to thank everybody for being here today. There are a lot of people on this, which is making me really happy. We had no idea how many people would elect to join us, so thank you, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elena Hernandez-Burke, and I'm the coordinator for Global Exchange Programs, as well as Hispanic Student Initiatives, and one of our directors of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Alverno College. And in my role as part of my role with HSI, I've been appointed as the chair of our staff and faculty committee that works on sort of centralizing and let's say like streamlining the way that we're approaching supporting our students at Alverno, especially through the lens as a Hispanic serving institution. So digging into the S part of our designation. And through that, we've been working in a subcommittee structure, and one of those committees is working on the topic of resources for DACA and undocumented students that we have on our campus. And we have been really excited to partner with the Civil Liberties Committee to bring this training to you today. Stephanie Melendrez from our admissions department has been working very hard to make this happen. I'm so grateful to you, Stephanie, for all of your hard work and your perseverance in making this happen. And so I don't want to take up too much time, but I hope that after today, we can maybe find some time to talk a little bit more about what our HSI committee has been working on and sharing that information and helping everyone on our campus feel that even if you're not physically on the committee, that you're a part of the work that we're trying to do to make sure that all of our students feel supported on our campus. So thank you everyone for being here, and I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Elena. And thank you everyone for being here today. My name's Stephanie Melendrez, and actually today's my 1-year anniversary at Alverno. So I've been at Alverno for about a year in the admissions department. And again, thank you all for being here today in this virtual training on understanding the documented student experience, advocacy, and allyship in higher education. This training is funded by the Menard Center for the Study of Institutions and Innovation and co-sponsored by Alverno's Hispanic Serving Institution Committee and Alverno's Civil Liberties Committee. Today's facilitators are, or will be, Katie Osorio and Alex Happ, who are part of Dreamers of Wisconsin. So if you didn't know about Dreamers of Wisconsin, they are a registered nonprofit serving undocumented, documented, and TPS holding students of all ages across the state of Wisconsin. I will let them introduce themselves in just a moment, but I want to start by saying a few words. So as staff, scholar practitioners, scholars of color, instructors, faculty, and leaders, there are many demands on us to meet the moment on college campuses than ever before. Many here today go above and beyond their official job duties to support historically marginalized communities on our campus and to get them to the right supports to admit them, retain them, and ensure they become leaders in their communities after graduation from Alverno. Although this work can be very rewarding, right? I want to encourage you all to take moments to take care of yourselves while not forgetting, pertaining to the topic on immigration, for example, that immigration and educational systems, whether K-12 or post-secondary education, are far more entangled than we may like to believe. Within Wisconsin's ambiguous policy context, educators and support staff have been left alone and frustrated for many years and have educated themselves despite the incomprehensibility of the immigration system to use whatever resources they could find to support the education of these students living in the state of Wisconsin. As a Catholic Franciscan college and one of less than 40 women's colleges in the nation, we have a long time role and history in advancing post-secondary diversity and inclusion for underserved populations while creating unique opportunities to empower women. I hope this training is one of many ways that we can continue to adopt the shared equity leadership model, because when it comes to undocumented and DACA students, we all have agency to get aligned so that we can empower, advise, connect them to the right people, and support them despite challenges. So yeah, without further ado, let us begin today's training, and I'll let Katie and Alex take the podium.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Thank you for joining us today. This is truly a significant training, and I will tell you why in a moment. I did want to highlight the fact that the training, I don't know how the timing happened, but the training is taking place today, which is even more special because yesterday was the start of Hispanic Heritage Month, a month representing the anniversary of Independence Day for many countries that some undocumented and DACA recipients might be from, like myself. Yesterday was the Independence Day for Honduras, which is where I am from. So that was very exciting. I also want to take a moment first to say thank you to Alverno for allowing me and Alex be part of this, the nonprofit of Dreamers of Wisconsin, to do this training. And I want to recognize Stephanie Melendres, who has nonstop been working on this and who has been part of introducing this training to Alverno. And this training is named Understanding the Undocumented and Dacamented Student Experience. You will hear more about what that is, the terms itself. Like I mentioned before, this is a significant training for Dreamers of Wisconsin. To do this training, it's important to me, myself too, because it is my life experience. And here's why. I know that this is a 3-hour training. Alex Hopp, my co-facilitator, and he will introduce himself in a moment. We both understand your time is valuable because we know we are taking 3 hours of your life. So by the end of this training, you can be prepared to probably change the life of one student or an individual in our community. It can sound like a big task, but you would be surprised that simple action can make a big difference and positively change the life of another person. So I want to thank you for taking the step to be here and being present in this training. I know we can all be in a training. We lived through COVID where we've been through so many meetings, and being in the training doesn't mean you're present in the training. So I definitely advocate if you have questions, interact, give us comments. And if you don't have anything until the very end, Stephanie will be someone that you can give questions. And we do have other things for you in regards to providing your questions to us. And let me introduce Dreamers of Wisconsin. Stephanie did a great job with it. It is a nonprofit focused on providing mentorship, resources, and scholarship to undocumented and DACA recipients. Part of the education piece is doing trainings like these to help increase the knowledge and fight against the negative stigma that there is behind undocumented and DACA students. And last but not least, hi, I'm Katie Osorio. I am the co-director of Dreamers of Wisconsin. You will get to know me more throughout this training. I am a mom of one, and I'm studying political science with a concentration in law. And I have an associate's in marketing, and I own a small business in Racine, Wisconsin. And one fun fact about me, I love pro wrestling. If you don't know what pro wrestling is, if you've heard of or think of WWE and these wrestlers, that's what I like. And I'm very passionate about it. But that's me. That's Dreamers of Wisconsin. Again, thank you. And I'm going to pass it over to Alex Hopp.
Hi, everybody. Well, first off, to echo what Katie's already said, a huge thank you to all of you for welcoming us into the Alverno community. And also, of course, a big thank you to Stephanie in particular. I know she's been really working overtime to help make this possible. But as Katie said, my name is Alex Hopp. I use he, him pronouns. I'm on the educational board for Dreamers of Wisconsin. And outside of that, I work as a lecturer at UW-Madison and the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I teach Asian American studies and history. So for some of you might be history fans, great. For those of you who aren't, I'll forgive you, I promise. And just a little fun fact about me, I was born and raised in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, if any of you are familiar. And I'm like a big Sheboygan guy, right? I love the brats, I love the lake, I love all of that, right? And so for me, it sounds weird to say that like my hobby is my hometown, but I live in Madison a couple hours away, and I really do enjoy getting to go back. So it might be the lamest fun fact of all time, but that's all I got for you. So I will share my screen in a second. so that we can see some slides, and you will all be provided with the slideshow after the presentation. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and look. I see people talking about the double brats in the chat. I'm just gonna tell you straight up, I will eat one tonight just because I saw it mentioned. But in any case, a couple disclaimers. Okay, so first off, as Katie said, we know your time is really valuable. We have a couple of interactive activities in this training to break up what can be the monotony of just learning information, right? When it comes to working with students of undocumented or documented status, information really is key, right? So there are ways in which this training, there is no substitute for just learning certain facts, right? Because it is so important to the experiences of our students. But on top of that, right, we'll have a couple little breaks, and we'll make sure that the 3 hours isn't too bad for everybody, right? I also want to mention, I put this in the chat a couple of times. Let's see if I can drop it one more time. There's a link to a Google form that will allow you to submit questions at any point during this training. At the very end of our time together, we are going to have about 15-ish minutes to do Q&A. Now, if everybody asks a question, we won't have a chance to answer them all, of course. But if you're somebody who has a question that you feel like hasn't been answered over the course of the training, and you really want to know, right, we are available after this training is completed, right, through email, through things like that, where we're happy to answer all of those things, okay? So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start the training officially. Quickly, sorry, last thing to mention is that link to submit questions will also be open for the foreseeable future. And you'll be able to access it through the presentation that we send out. So if you have something that comes up, say 3 weeks from now, right, you will be able to submit that question. And as an organization, we can work on getting you an answer if there's something specific. With that being said, here we go.
Killing me.
All right. So Katie already introduced Dreamers of Wisconsin. There's our little logo. So we're active on all social media pages. You'll see us at different kinds of events. We are active across the state of Wisconsin. So we do, I think actually our latest event is a mentorship program, and it actually took place not too far from Alverno's campus at a bowling alley in Milwaukee. So you might see us around the community. Hopefully you'll see us around the community. Again, this is where you can click to submit the questions. You can also use the link in the chat. But so to start off with our training, what's really, really important is to understand our terms. And we came in and we created this training with no expectation of prior knowledge, right? So if you are familiar with one of these terms, that's amazing, that's fantastic, and that's really awesome in serving students. But we're going to go over them anyways, just so that we can all be on the same page, right? And so first off, we have an undocumented immigrant. What does that term mean, right? So undocumented immigrants can exist in any country in the world, and it refers to anyone residing in a country without legal documentation. In the United States, it includes people who entered without inspection or proper permission from the government, and those who entered legally with a legal visa that is no longer valid. So actually, if you look at the statistics, the vast majority of undocumented immigrants are people who overstay a visa, right? So you come in, you get a working visa, it says, you got to leave on this date, and you just don't leave. And that is one of the primary methods of undocumented immigration in the United States. The other thing to mention about undocumented immigration is that when we say legal documentation, that really depends on what state you are living in, right? So for some states, even if you are undocumented, you might be able to get something like an ID or a driver's license, right? In other states, you won't be able to get any documentation of any sort. So again, undocumented, its meaning is in the name, right? Now moving on to Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. So DACA is the name of the program. Although there isn't a super standardized way to discuss individuals who have DACA status, for the sake of this training, and something you will hear frequently, is the phrase documented, right? So we have undocumented students and we'll have documented students. Documented students and DACA is an administrative relief program, and it has specific eligibility requirements. But if you meet those requirements, and the requirements are related to coming to the United States through undocumented immigration when you were a child, you'll be able to qualify for this program that gives you certain protections. Very specifically, it gives you protection from deportation, and it gives you a work permit, so the ability to be hired and to work in the United States. However, these permits, right, this DACA status and this work permit, as an administrative thing, you have to renew it every 2 years. And although we'll talk about this more in a little bit, right, DACA is something that is was enacted through executive order, and it's something that's been challenged by the courts really frequently. It's not something that's been signed into law. And so because of that, right, there are significant changes that occur within this administrative program, even if the name stays the same, right? But in general, you could think of the primary difference between an undocumented student and a documented student as one of their ability to work and their ability to be safe from things like deportation. And then finally, the other status that you may or may not have heard of before is temporary protected status. And generally we refer to this as a TPS holding students. A temporary protected status program is one that allows migrants whose home countries are considered unsafe the right to live and work in the United States for a temporary but extendable period of time. So you can think about it a little bit like asylum status, but definitely much more up in the air, not as permanent. And what's important to know about this are kind of two main things. First of all, unlike the other two statuses that we've discussed, TPS status is very much up in the air. In the sense that its meaning changes. There aren't well-established guidelines and regulations for what you can do with TPS status and what you can't, right? And so in general, right, it is a form of documentation that gives you the ability to live and work in the United States, but it's a really unsteady and unstable form of documentation that has been known to change frequently. The other important thing to mention is that our current administration has indicated that they are hoping to greatly expand TPS status and the TPS program over the rest of their term. And so it's looking like about 300,000 new individuals will be admitted into the United States through TPS status. And that's kind of like the starting base. And obviously politics change. Our goal here is not to give you a political presentation at all. But just so we're aware, right, that like these things do change frequently depending on the political winds in the country. Primarily, the identity that has the most TPS holding students are Venezuelan immigrants who have been fleeing unrest in their country, and the majority of the 300,000 new prospective arrivals will also be Venezuelan. So in a place like Alverno, that is, a Hispanic serving institution, it is likely, right, that some of those students will end up here. So an important thing to understand, many of you will have heard of Dreamers before, right? And if you haven't heard of it, you heard it in the name of our nonprofit, right? So I know you've all heard of it, at least in some way. It's important to understand what the difference between Dreamers and DACA is, because it helps us kind of get at what the challenges that undocumented and documented students face. So the DREAM Act stands for the 2001 Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act. And it would have allowed undocumented youth to adjust their status to legal permanent resident if they meet certain conditions. So there are a couple really specific differences between this and the current DACA program, DACA administrative program, that are really important. So first off, both programs require you to essentially be a child when you arrive in the country. Both programs reward educational attainment, and both require that you've been in the United States for a certain period of time, right? However, the difference with Dreamers is that permanent resident status is something that you don't have to renew, right? It's a status that is much more solid and much more certain than other statuses, right? Than the status you get for DACA, right? Remember, you have to renew that every 2 years. To give you all a little bit of perspective, one of the other communities that is, prevalent in Milwaukee and in the state of Wisconsin are Hmong American students, right? And when Hmong Americans arrived in the United States as refugees, they were given legal status, right? And so this would have been giving these students the same sort of thing, right? A permanent ability to stay in the United States, and with the certainty that that would be protected. Now, the other thing that I want to mention here, and this is where the history in me will come out. So for those of you who were excited, here you go. You'll notice, right, that some of the restrictions put in place with this act when it was being proposed were something like they have to have good moral character, right? And I think for those of us who are unfamiliar with immigration history, that seems out of place, right? How does a country determine if you have good moral character or not, right? And the reason I want to point this out is because it speaks to kind of the history of immigration, and particularly non-white immigration, and the way that it's been seen as much less of a welcoming act and much more of a way to kind of close the gates to the United States, right? Because if anything, if good moral character is something that's subjective, right? Good moral character is something that can be used to keep anybody out of the country. And you can trace the roots of this sort of program back even from 2001 all the way back to the 1800s with things like Chinese exclusion, and then later on, right, with things like the criminalization of undocumented immigration, right? And so I think the reason that I want to point that out is just so that we understand that the situation we're in now is not something that's accidental. It is the way that the system is designed to work, right? And so as we go through and we hear about things that for some of us may feel unfair, for some of us might seem like they don't make much sense, just understand that these are the way that these things are supposed to work. They've been intentionally created in that way. So we move from the Dreamers Act that doesn't pass, right, gets shot down, and we move over to DACA, which is the program that we have now. DACA, again, is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it was a program created by executive order by President Obama in 2012. It's a discretionary limited immigration benefit. So what that means is the government reserves the right to kind of change it as they will, and to refuse it to somebody even if they would qualify under the provisions. Limited also means, right, that if it were to be too many applicants, right, they would be able to reject applicants based on the number of people applying. So the requirements to qualify for DACA are that you've arrived in the United States before the age of 16, that you've resided in the United States for at least a 5-year period, that you're currently in school, have graduated from high school, have obtained a GED, or have been honorably discharged from the Coast Guard or Armed Forces. And this is important, right? Because we'll see later on that actually documented students make up a significant portion of all undocumented and documented students in higher education. And that's because there is an educational requirement attached to documented status that is not necessarily present for undocumented students, right? Or undocumented folk across the country. Additionally, right, there's a requirement about your legal conduct, right? So you haven't been convicted of a felony, a significant misdemeanor, or any 3 misdemeanors of any kind. And so significant misdemeanor are generally misdemeanors that are associated with either drugs or with violent offenses. And then obviously, felonies are the most severe type of punishment. 3 misdemeanors of any kind can be just about anything, right? From, people stealing a candy bar from a store to, anything else like that. And then finally, they also included, not posing a threat to national security or public safety. And this was included in the provisions as a way to kind of satisfy people who are worried about the question of terrorism, right? And so this, again, gives the government a discretionary way to really reject anybody who applies, even if they meet all the other requirements. The other really big thing that goes into for DACA status is that you have to provide a truly incredible amount of documentary evidence. And when I say that, right, again, I'm a historian, so I know a thing or two about too much evidence and too much citations and all that. It really is a lot. You really have to prove every single one of these things beyond a shadow of a doubt. And in addition to that, you have to submit to a pretty significant period of being documented, right? Like physically, to take your fingerprints, right? Take your photo, like a way so that the state knows exactly who you are and they're able to find you pretty much whenever they need to. So to give you an idea of kind of a national snapshot of undocumented and documented students, I do want to qualify all of the statistics that are here that they are based on estimates, right? And so I think all of us can understand why somebody who does hold one of these statuses might be reluctant to share what that status is, right? And we'll talk about the question of confidentiality later on in the training. But because of that, all of these statistics are based on the US Census's community survey, and it's their 1-year estimates, right? So it's the best type of data that we have, but it's not 100% accurate, right? But it still gives us a pretty good idea. So one of the things that we could start off by saying is that there are, at least for me when I first saw this data, right, more undocumented and documented students in post-secondary education than I may have initially thought, right? So the best estimates are that of 2018, there's 454,000, making up 2% of the students in post-secondary education. There's also, the best estimates say 216,000 DACA eligible students in post-secondary education. So DACA eligible includes students who do have DACA provisions already, and also those who would be eligible but haven't actually applied and fill out that information. And so that's about half of the undocumented students that they think are currently in higher education. One other thing to note about this is, right, this was taken in 2018, and generally we've seen a steady growth in the number of undocumented and DACA eligible students in higher education every single year, regardless of kind of political climate. And that's kind of for two main reasons. One, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's been an increase in undocumented immigration, right? But what it does mean is that more and more students are pursuing higher education despite their undocumented or documented status. And I think what that speaks to is kind of too the way that status has become something that's been in the national spotlight lately. And because of that, I think it's both had the impact of creating really difficult situations for undocumented and DACA eligible students, but also in many ways creating a better sense of community that can support students as they pursue post-secondary education. Now, another important thing to point out, if you look at the graphic down below, is that undocumented and DACA eligible students in higher education are not just Hispanic, right? And I know Alverno is a Hispanic serving institution. And I think the stereotype that we think of when we think of a undocumented or documented student is somebody of Hispanic descent. And excuse me, as you can see, there really is a significant amount of racial and ethnic diversity within these populations of students, right? And so I think part of the reason that this statistic is so important is because it helps us as educators, right, who are going to work with a diverse student body, understand the variety of experiences that can occur even within this one identity. So specifically, if you look at undocumented students, right, what I want to highlight is, excuse me, that 15% of undocumented students identify as Black. And in general, the majority of those students come from places like Haiti and places like the Dominican Republic. Additionally, 25% identify as Asian American or Pacific Islander. And this is often the case. This is the fastest growing group of undocumented students, the fastest growing undocumented population in the United States. And primarily this sort of undocumented immigration occurs through overstaying visas. And then finally, of course, right, we have 12% that are identify as white and 46% that identify as Latinx or Hispanic, right? And so in some ways, right, the stereotype that we think of when we picture an undocumented student in our head, it's somewhat reflected in the data, but it's really important for us to understand that there is no one race that is associated with undocumented status or documented status. And I think when we understand that, right, we are better able to support the full range of our students' potential experiences. And then lastly, just a quick look at undocumented and documented students in higher education by the age of their arrival. What I really want to point to about this is that, the vast majority of undocumented and DACA eligible college students, they arrived in the United States when they were really, really young. They are in many ways, especially culturally, American, right? And so I think another thing that another stereotype that we kind of want to dispel is that the portrait of an undocumented student as somebody who is an alien in the United States, who is unsure of what they're being here, who don't have ties to the community, who are just here to, take advantage of something and then go back home. I think that's actually one of the most harmful stereotypes that exists when we're talking about undocumented and documented students in higher education. And as the data shows, right, that's just not accurate. So of course, what we really care about, right, given that we are embedded in our own community, is a quick snapshot of undocumented immigrants in Wisconsin. And again, this data comes from 2020 and is also based on estimates taken from the American Immigration Council, and they cooperate with the U.S. Census Bureau to try and arrive at this data. So we see that there's roughly 75,000 undocumented immigrants living in Wisconsin, and that composes 24% of our immigrant population, right? Our immigrant population. Additionally, there are 6,540 DACA recipients in the state, and that represents 58% of the eligible individuals who would be able to apply to DACA and get that status. Estimates from the U.S. Census Bureau, and again, we just don't know, suggest that there are at least 4,000 undocumented students that are enrolled in higher education in the state. Now, there is a report from the UW system schools where they did some internal data management, and they determined that about 4,000 undocumented students were enrolled just in the UW system. And so if you take these 2 points of data together, what that suggests to me, right, is that there are actually probably much more than just this 4,000 number, but 4,000 is kind of the low end estimate. And then finally, the other big thing that we hadn't mentioned when we talk about potential statuses, right, is what we call a mixed household status. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's when somebody lives in a household that contains undocumented or documented immigrants, even if they themselves are a citizen or hold some other status. And so if you look at that number, it's actually even way bigger than the 75,000. It's almost 120,000 individuals in Wisconsin live in a household with undocumented immigrants. And that includes over 55,000 US citizens. And so I think, although, right, this training is specifically focused on students who are undocumented or documented themselves, it's easy for us to think through and understand how a mixed status household has impacts on students' educational experiences. If you're worried about changes in law that might result in your parents being deported, it's going to be really, really difficult to focus on school. And so many of the challenges and many of the things that we'll talk about as we go through this process apply to students who are US citizens because of the way that it impacts their loved ones, because of the way that it impacts their families. And I think keeping that in mind, not just when we think about, right, what is the web of students that we can help through knowing this information and better support through a training like this, it's a lot wider than we might initially expect. So I thank you all for bearing with me for the first little part of our lecture where we provided that basic information. We are going to do an activity, and we're going to start this activity as an individual thing. You'll have about 10 minutes, and then we're going to move you into small breakout rooms to discuss just for a little bit of time, okay? So what I would like everybody to do is to take out a piece of paper or something that they're able to write on. You won't have to share this, right? This is just for you. So there's no pressure and no stress at all. And I'll give you all about 30 seconds to do that before I go into the actual instructions. right. And as I share my screen, it's kind of hard for me to see how everybody's doing. So if you're still scrambling to get paper, I apologize, but I've never been known for my patience. So I will get started with the instructions. So what we're going to try and do with this activity is to get us to all individually reflect on our own journeys through education and higher education, and think about how those journeys are complicated, by the question of status. So what I would like you all to do is to take your piece of paper and draw a large spiral, right? So we could think about it like the spiral we saw on the previous page, just a big spiral with plenty of space between the lines. Once you do that, I want you to go to the start of the spiral and label it with birth, and then go to the very end of the spiral and label it with death. And I know that's a little bit morbid, but really, in true historian fashion, this is just marking a timeline for ourselves so that we can kind of understand how we're going to label it as we go. Now I'm going to give us all about 3 minutes, 4 minutes to do this. We're going to do this initial part of the activity together. And I want you to go through and make little dots on that spiral across the lifespan that are key moments that have impacted you with a specific focus on education, right? So for some of you, right, it could be something like high school graduation. It could be graduate school applications. It could be graduating with your doctorate. It could be deciding to go to a master's program, right? And I want you to try and get as many of those moments down and labeled as you possibly can across this spiral, right? So put it in order. We want to have a visual representation of what your life cycle looks like with a specific focus on education. It doesn't have to just be limited to education, right? If you feel like there's another moment in your life where it's like, it would not feel right for me to not include this when I'm thinking through this activity, please feel free to put it down. My goal here is not to gatekeep. I'm not going to grade you on this, right? In fact, I think many of you should probably be grading me instead. But go through and mark down these different things. And so while you do that, I'll tell you that, for me, the first couple major points that I thought of were, one, a meeting I had with a guidance counselor when I was in middle school, who told me, he said, Alex, for you, college is a necessity. You have to go. You have to get out of Sheboygan. You have to do that. And for me, it really clarified, right? As somebody who's, my mom was a stay-at-home mom, my dad worked in construction his whole life, didn't go to college, but it was a huge moment for me. It's this thing that stands out. I can also think of course, my high school graduation. I think about taking the ACT and the SAT. I think about applying to grad school. I think about graduating. I think about applying to another grad school, all of these different things. So I will finally shut up for the next about 3 minutes. I got a little timer on my phone, and then we'll come back together to go on to the third part of this activity. Like I said, you want to aim for probably at least 8-ish, 8 to 10 dots at a minimum. Okay, and we'll take about 30 more seconds for you to continue to kind of finish up the last couple points that you can think of that were significant in your life and in your educational journey in particular. All right, so what we should have now is a spiral with a few different dots on it, right, that indicate your life journey with a specific focus on your educational journey. What we're going to do now is I'm going to ask you to take a second and just think about what the most impactful identities are that you hold, right? So for me, and it can be one identity or it can be multiple of your identities together, right? So for me, when I do this activity, I often think about my experience as a white man, right? And so what we're going to do is go through each point, and you're going to think about what are the ways that your identities gave you certain privileges that help facilitate your experience. And then also, what are the ways that your identity at each specific point may have resulted in additional burdens, right? So for me, right, I mentioned that one of the points that mattered for me was that meeting with my guidance counselor, right? And I will compare it to the experiences of my partner, who is Asian American, the daughter of refugees, right? When she met with a guidance counselor, they asked her where she was planning to work after graduation because they knew that she wasn't going to go to college, right? And so we can see how there's a very specific difference, right, between her experiences and my experiences, where guidance counselor looks at me and says, hey, we're going to send you to school. I know you're going to go, right? And so this can look, there is no right or wrong answer here. This will look different for every single person. But I just want you to go through each specific dot. We're going to take about 5 minutes to do this, come back together about 150 to go through each of your different dots and think about what were the ways that your identities gave you advantages at each of these different moments in your journey, and what are the ways that your identities may have resulted in additional burdens. Now, depending on what your identities are, you may struggle to identify privileges that you had, or you may struggle to identify additional burdens that you had, and that's completely fine, right? What's important is that we go through right here and we think about how our identities impact our ability to be on our educational journey. And I should add quickly that I know as educators, right, and especially as evidenced, right, by the fact that there's 100 of us who came together for this training. I know these are things that we've thought about before, right? But what I really want to do is try and give us this personal connection to the students that we're hoping to better serve here today, so that we can really think through, right, what are our experiences and how are they similar and different to the students that we're going to meet with. So about 5 minutes, I will actually shut up now, and we will come back together in just a little bit. All right, so we're gonna have about a minute for y'all to finish that portion up. And I know, again, I'm cheating a little bit on the time, rushing us just a little bit, but I wanna make sure we get everything in. What we're gonna do now is ask you all to join breakout rooms in just a second after I give the instructions. And you're gonna have 10 minutes, and in those 10 minutes, I'd like you all to do two specific things. And we'll make an announcement about halfway through so you know when to do these things. But the first thing you're gonna do is share your experiences with the other people in the group, right? Share your spiral. And remember, I want us to do this in a way that makes us all comfortable, right? So if there's a deeply personal part of this journey that you wrote down that you really don't want to discuss, that is completely fine, right?
I'm on a
Fine.
meeting.
However, I would encourage you all to consider being vulnerable here, right? One of the cool things about a training like this is that it can really bring the community together in support of a common goal. And so I just asked, right, that we're all respectful of each other's boundaries, but that we're willing to try and be a little bit vulnerable as we go through this. So about 5 minutes, we'll have everybody in your small group will share their experiences, share their spirals. And then I want you to come together and to think about what an undocumented student spiral might look like, right? You can use events that you wrote down on your own. You can brainstorm new specific points in the journey. But I want you to go through and just kind of, as a mental exercise, think about how would an undocumented student or a documented student complete this sort of activity. Now, originally, when we thought there might be a little bit less of you, we were going to come together and actually create one collectively. But what we're going to do instead, once we're done with this small group time, is have Katie share her journey as somebody who is able to speak to what these specific experiences are like. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to ask our lovely Zoom support to put us all into, or put everybody else into breakout rooms. And then we will come back together in about 10 minutes again, share your own spiral for the first half, and then spend some time discussing what you think an undocumented or documented student spiral might look like. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming back. I do see a comment in the chat that it was a little bit too short, and we do apologize, right? I have a habit of talking a little bit too much, so that's on me. We will have another activity in the second half of the presentation after our break that will put you back into breakout rooms to have you discuss specific scenarios. So if you're somebody who really values that time to, communicate with each other, to build that community, to pick each other's brains, we will definitely have that opportunity. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to hand it over to Katie. Katie is going to graciously share her spiral with us. so that we can get an understanding of what this activity looks like from a different perspective.
All right, let me make sure I can move this correctly so you guys can see. So my spiral, like I was telling earlier in this conversation, when I was talking to Alex about my spiral, I felt it was very cluttered. I feel like there was just so much chaos in it. And going over my spiral, there's a lot of things that were hard for me to talk about when I was younger. And as I grew, I realized that that's my life, right? So I do apologize if I hesitate in some places, just because there are things that I like put in the back of my head, and then I have to just bring back just for the purpose of this training. So I'll start with, and just to verify, Alex, you're able to see the perfect. All right, so I was born. Obviously, the best thing is I was born. And then my parents left to the US seeking the American dream. I was a little over a year old. My mom had to leave so they could afford giving me a better future while I was still in Honduras. I was born in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. And then there came a time where my parents realized, when being in America, that, hey, we miss our daughter, our only child, and we think there could be a good future and opportunities for our daughter. So they had a conversation with my family in Honduras that they wanted me to immigrate to America. How does that work? Well, you would pay a coyote, that's what you call them, a coyote. And these individuals will get paid and bring a child like myself to America. And normally it's in groups. That's how you immigrate to America. I know some other immigrants go through different ways. It could be from riding a train, the top of the train, not inside the train, or through a plane and overstay their visa, things like that. Those are some things that happens when you immigrate to a different country. However, I did it the way that I woke up one day and pretty much was said, hey, here's a coyote, take care of our daughter. And a relative actually volunteered and said, I'm going to come with you because I am afraid of what can happen when you leave to this other country. So I traveled, I walked to America. And when I came to America, I genuinely thought that was normal. I thought that every kid does that. So that was my surprise. I started kindergarten, which was significant. I only knew hi and yes. I didn't know English like that. And I genuinely thought that it was normal to do these things. I grew up in elementary school thinking, oh, your parents are always in fear. That's normal. Oh, it's normal for your parents to tell you not to tell people you're from a different country, because then there's more questions. So I thought that was normal. It was significant because I had to learn English. And when I started 6th grade, middle school, I am starting to learn more about who I am, what I want to do in the future. And then my mother gets deported. And that's something that I didn't realize would happen. I would hear it in the news. I would hear my parents talk about it. That is the time in 6th grade, and something we don't talk about when you hear undocumented or DACA-mented students. You can ask them, not ask them, I apologize. A lot of times we ourselves are undocumented, DACA-mented students don't realize we're undocumented until something like this can happen. I didn't know I was undocumented till 6th grade. I had hopes and dreams that I would be able to be president and not know I'm not a US citizen. And that's when it hit me. I was like, whoa, this place that I call home isn't my home. And I'll tell you the scenario about the deportation of my mother because it is important to understand what a mixed status family can go through. So my parents are immigrants. I am undocumented at that time too. My siblings are US citizen. My siblings were under 5. My mother got stopped at like a regular stop. They just got stopped. The police officer pulled her over and it seemed like a routine pullover. My mom was nervous, undocumented again. And he checked her ID, which wasn't an ID that would, it was an expired ID from her country. I apologize, from Honduras. And he came back to the car and told her, please call someone to pick up your kids. ICE will be coming to pick you up. And I wasn't there. I could only imagine what my siblings saw. All I remember is what they told me. They told me after that my siblings were crying. My siblings were seeing their mother get pulled away, handcuffed, and that was it. that same day I was going to class. And why it's significant is I was a teenager, you guys, and a lot of these students that you're teaching have been teenagers. You yourself have been teenagers. And that day, I remember I argued with my mom. I argued with my mom in the morning, telling her, I don't want to wear those shoes you want me to wear. I don't care. I don't wear whatever. Drop me off. She said, I love you. Goodbye. I said nothing. I left. And that same afternoon, that's when my dad came to pick me up early to tell me your mother got deported. And that's when it hit me like, I'm not going to be able to touch or see my mom physically. Maybe never. And that's kind of the significance of the moment I realized, who am I? What am I doing in this country? What is the goal? Why did my parents bring me here? And then after that, I was realization that I am undocumented. And the deportation, I apologize. After the deportation, my dad had to now make double his income to make ends meet. So he ended up moving to a different state, leaving me and my siblings to a relative so he could try and pay for the rent where we were living, give us food, and so on. And hopefully one day get an education. That meant that I was the responsible individual for my siblings. I know my relative was there, but I was the one taking care of them. And unfortunately, a lot of students, a lot of undocumented individuals that are older siblings, even younger siblings, have to do that. Then, thankfully, came around, and we'll talk more about it in the legal aspect of it. I became a DACA recipient. That opened the doors to many things. I was able to go to high school and get my first job. I got my work permit that allowed me to get a job so I could pay and save money to pay for an education. So that's how it works. With a work permit, you're able to get an education, undocumented or DACA, you still can get an education. But however, how can you get an education without money? So that's why you need a work permit. Then I was able to get an apprenticeship, graduate high school, graduate with an associate's degree simultaneously. I did it all at the same time, and I'll talk about it later. I met my fiance. The reason why I did put it at a significant point is because how many of you, maybe none, have told your significant other like about your past relationships or mistakes or achievements you've made? I had to sit down my fiance and tell him, like when we were just dating, hey, I am a DACA student. And I had to almost like this training, actually tell him step by step of what that meant. And since he's been with me, he's gone through it. He's gone through going to immigration or having to do my biometrics, which you'll learn more about. And it hit him because he's a US citizen and realized, you're doing this? This is normal to you? And I was like, yeah, this is my normal year. That's a normal year for me. I then realized that, hey, I have an associate's degree. I want to have something tangible. Also, when I'm here in the US, we build a business. We have a small business. I also then transferred to a 4-year university, which that university, I grew up 5 minutes away. I had my from kindergarten to high school. And I came to that school and they told me that even though I live 5 minutes away, I am going to be paying double the tuition. No ifs, ands, or buts, no other questions. And you'll learn more about that. Then my mom decided to do one last try. She actually decided to immigrate one more time. And when you decide to immigrate to a different country, you are risking your life. You see things that will probably traumatize you. And that's a decision she made because she knew that myself and my siblings needed a mother. Then she was able to come in. She ended up staying in the detention center for over a year, fighting her case. A lawyer was given to her, and the lawyer told her right away, sign a document, get sent back. There's no reason for you to fight or to come fight for this because you'll be here probably for years. And that's true, it can happen. And she fought, and she's thankfully now here fighting for asylum. And then I joined Dreamers of Wisconsin because in this spiral, there's a lot of bitterness and a lot of sadness. I didn't have a community behind me. I didn't have anyone to support me or to understand what I was going through. And I joined it, and then I became a mom. And it's significant because I didn't realize how my immigration status would impact me psychologically when I became a mom. And then that's where I stopped with my spiral. I don't have anything else, thankfully. But it's definitely a lot more cluttered and chaotic. And I know that everyone else here has something probably chaotic. Their own spiral might be chaotic. And then there's things that I genuinely thought were normal that are not. And that's why it's significant for the students that you teach, for the people in the community, that they might not realize that what they've gone through is not normal, and we need support. There's a lot of that we need. I'm gonna go ahead, give me one quick second here to look. So you heard a majority of my story of being undocumented. I was undocumented, then I became a DACA recipient, which opened the doors to even more things. Again, I have 3 things I want to mention, which is constant fear of deportation, secrecy and trust, higher levels of stress due to financial barriers. I am a small business owner. My business is digital marketing, named Championship Digital Media Agency. We were established since 2019. I have been part of Dreamers of Wisconsin since 2020. I graduated from high school and received my marketing associates simultaneously. I have a 1-year-old, and I'm learning how to be a mom that is healthy and encouraging. When I tell people that I received my associates and my high school diploma at the same time, a lot of people think, oh, you're such an overachiever, you're so resilient. However, I don't think they realize that that's not at all what I wanted. I chose to get an associate's degree because I received DACA and it gets renewed every 2 years. I realized an associate's degree, if I put all the time and effort into it, can be completed in those 2 years, which in case DACA got taken away, I got deported, I had something tangible to bring back to my country so I could get a job, get an opportunity there too. So I ended up working at the age of 15 to make ends meet for my family. My dad couldn't pay bills by himself, so I would try to work so I could financially help my dad. All my life, I've lived in survival mode. That's all I've known. Again, I wish I wasn't an overachiever. A lot of students that are DACA and undocumented, they do everything they can to get their education. And they sometimes wish they could enjoy the idea of college. I always dreamt of that, the idea of college, but college was never really something I could enjoy. I love education, I love learning, and I didn't have the opportunity to learn and just enjoy it. So I have a photo on this slide that shows the length between Tegucigalpa, Honduras, which is where I'm from, Honduras, and the US. So I walked all that while I was 4. I came to this country around in like January, so there was snow. It was my first time seeing snow. And the reason why I mentioned these 3 things, right? Constant fear of deportation, secrecy and trust, higher levels of stress due to financial barriers. Constant fear of deportation, whether their own deportation or deportation of loved ones. My mom did get deported. People in the community here, this person got deported, it can happen to you. So there's that fear that it has happened somewhere near you, it could happen to you. So it's constant. Secrecy and trust. Anytime I would bring my immigration status to an adult during my college career, my high school career, elementary, they would never understand and didn't know who to go to. One thing I do mention is, I tell you these things, I tell you my story. I do not want you to be sorry for me, and you do not want to be sorry to these students, because it is our lives, and I don't want to be sorry for my life. I want to take action, and we want to take action for our lives to do something. And when someone does reveal their status, understand it is important, and it is not something to just brush off. If I were to tell you this, like, oh, I'm a DACA recipient, and you're the only one who knows, don't try your best to just acknowledge and understand that it is important. And higher levels of stress due to financial barriers, anxiety about the future is constant in your mind, unprecedentedly high occurrences of depression, anxiety, substance use abuse, and suicidal ideation is something you will see in a graph too, that there's a higher percentage on that. So DACA and being undocumented affects not just education, but your future outside of school. I became a mother, and because of this trauma of what happened when I was younger, of immigrating, having to learn a new language, which sounds great, and having my mom be deported, there was a lot of trauma behind my immigration status, and not having a mother figure during the years that were most important, my teenage years, it led me to postpartum depression and anxiety. I couldn't hold my baby. I was suicidal because I never once realized how much my immigration status impacted me psychologically. I focused so much on education and I had my child with me, and I couldn't. I realized, like, why can't I? Like, I thought education was my only obstacle in this life with my immigration status. I didn't realize that also motherhood would be impacted. And that's why it's significant with the undocumented students, undocumented students. When you're talking to them, know that you, as educators, as staff, as faculty, you're seeing them as students. But once they leave the university, once they leave the college, they are part of the community. They will have their own children. They will be part of the boards, be part of committees. And it is important to be there and be of support. So that is my experience. And I'm thankful that you have allowed me to be here, because for some, I might be the first undocumented and DACA or DACamented student anyone has ever met. I've had that experience. And if this is the first time you meet someone who has DACA, hello, my name is Katie. You got to learn a little bit more about me. And it is meant to, truly what you're doing is going to change the life of someone. I've had that impact through every educator I have had a conversation with. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass this over to Alex, because we do have more. I don't want to take more time off of you guys' time for this training.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. Yeah, I think, whenever you hear somebody share their story like this, right, I think it's definitely good to take a step back and to just be grateful for the vulnerability and willingness to do that. So on behalf of all of us, Katie, thank you for that. For the sake of time, we are going to skip this slide that includes a video. I would highly encourage you all to check this video out, because it gives us a better insight into other undocumented student experiences as well, right? But just for the sake of time, to make sure we can get through all the important information, we are going to move past it. So a little bit of what we're going to do now. We're going to talk about the biggest impacts that status has on undocumented student experiences, right? So these are very specifically the types of things that undocumented students at Alverno and at other colleges in the state will have to deal with. So first off, and Katie mentioned this when she said that she had to pay double tuition, even though she grew up 5 minutes from her institution, there is no access to in-state tuition in the state of Wisconsin for undocumented students. It doesn't matter where they live. It doesn't matter if they were, in Wisconsin from the age of 4 until they go to college. They are not able to have access to in-state tuition. They have to pay out of state. Now, for a college like Alverno, right, it as a private institution, it's not necessarily the same thing. But I think where this is still relevant is it helps us understand what undocumented students' options are when they're looking at the landscape of higher education. One of the things about Wisconsin that I think is particularly cruel about this policy is that there was a period in which in-state tuition was extended to undocumented students who met certain criteria. And in general, that criteria was, living in the state and completing high school here. We had it and it was revoked. And there's been recent attempts to try and pass in-state tuition laws that line up with other states across the US, and they've all been rejected. You can see on the map, right, the red colors are basically states with the strictest the most restrictive tuition and financial aid equity laws for undocumented and documented students, and Wisconsin is red. So something to keep in mind. Additionally, all right, we want to talk about access to state and federal financial aid. And essentially, what's important to know is that whether you are undocumented or documented, you are not eligible for federal financial aid, including work study. You're not eligible for Wisconsin state financial aid, and you are excluded from participation in federally funded TRIO programs. And so even if you have that temporary protected status, right, you are still not allowed to participate in these programs. And to give you all an idea, if you're unfamiliar with what a TRIO program is, a TRIO program is a federally funded initiative. It takes the form of a few different programs underneath that umbrella, all of which are designed to promote and increase retention for first generation students, students of color, students with disabilities, and a few other categories. And so Although many undocumented or documented students would qualify for these programs, they are excluded on basis of their status. What undocumented and documented students are eligible for are some scholarships. Now we say some scholarships because although many scholarships are private, some will say you have to prove your citizenship status, right? Some will say only available to US citizens. And so that's on a case-by-case basis, something to look out for, especially, you know, if you're telling a student what options might be available to them. They're also eligible for some institutional aid. So different places have different rules. Alverno does offer institutional aid to undocumented students. And so that is a resource specific to Alverno. We'll talk about that and Alverno specific resources more in a little while. And then finally, and I think this is, you know, in some ways uniquely predatory, undocumented and documented students are eligible for private loans. And oftentimes that is what they are referred to if they are attempting to seek an education. And I think it goes without saying, but in case we're unclear, right, there have been cases and lawsuits of, you know, private loan companies who have one rate for US citizens and another much higher rate for undocumented or documented students. And so it's exactly the type of financial burden and financial trap that you would expect. Another really important thing is that, you know, like Katie said, right, Katie had to work to try and pay for her schooling, and she worked from a young age. But the reason she was able to do that is because she did have that DACA status. For students that are undocumented, they are not eligible to work. They're not, and that includes working on campus for a job through Alverno, right? They are completely prohibited by law from working. And then finally, just as a note, right, talking about mixed status families, students with undocumented parents are eligible for financial aid. You essentially just put in zeros when it asks for your parents' identification documents. However, the risk there, right, is the risk of disclosure, the risk of exposure. And so because of that, it's, you know, there is a risk involved, even though a student from a mixed status family is eligible. So impact 2, Katie will speak about a little bit.
I did want to also say, I see the chats and thank you everyone. You guys have been providing some of the information and some questions before we have gotten to them. So thank you so much for doing that. That's the best. It helps to know that you guys are a community. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about impact 2, uncertainty and legal precarity. So the legal precarity here is that the DACA, if you see on the right side, DACA timeline, there were quite a bit of changes throughout the years in regards to DACA. So the first one was the DREAM Act was proposed, that didn't go through. And then in 2003, 2008, there was different versions of it. It still was not getting enough support. And then from 2010 to 2011, the DREAM Act gained momentum. And I'm just double checking here. With 2011, California enacted the California DREAM Act. That is where I want to highlight that it says California DREAM Act. You might face students who say, hey, but I know other universities that do offer in-state. That might be because that university is located in a different state. California, that's the example, allows in-state tuition for these students. They have a lot of scholarships. A majority of the scholarships that I do see in lists that are provided as resources to students are only for students that are resident or have gone to high school in California. And that's a big problem because scholarships are like a needle in a haystack. There's one, like, I'm going to use an example, like 100 students and one scholarship. Well, imagine with undocumented plus undocumented in mind, there's hundreds of students looking for one scholarship. So that's important to note. And then last but not least, 2012 is when President Obama enacted DACA. And that is where I want to highlight, it was an executive order. So there was potential to have the next president take that away. And that was what everyone was fearing. And one thing I want to mention, I have been in panels when there was discussions of having DACA be taken away. One thing that I remember is that we undocumented, documented students have lived in fear for so many years that we are okay to live in fear if it means we get to fight for our rights and fight for in-state tuition and driver's license and work permit and so on. So DACA, that's the fight that's happening at this moment. If you've heard in the news, right now the fight is to solidify DACA even more, because there's states that are allowing people to fight and say, hey, DACA should allow these students, and there's a lot of back and forth. So that is what's happening. DACA isn't a law. It was an executive order, so it can be taken away, it can be changed. On the left side, there is a process and tips on DACA. I have to renew mine every 2 years. However, it seems to me like every year, because you do have to save the money. I like to say I pay sort of a subscription to work for, like, in the United States. I pay roughly $4.95. $4.95 is the filing fee, but I also pay a little bit more if you're going to work with a lawyer. And there's some places, which you'll learn later, there's resources to not have to pay an extra amount. But when you are young, you listen to your parents, and your parents probably heard from their neighbor, a person they might know who could help you file this out, so they will charge you a little bit more. So that's something I like to bring out there. Also, once you have sent out your application for DACA, you will renew that every 2 years, unless there's different news that DACA can't be renewed or it's frozen. You will go to get your biometrics. You will have a biometrics appointment. You get your biometrics done, and then you will get an answer from the UCSIS. Oh, I just forgot it. I apologize. I had it here. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. They'll give you an answer in regards to where you stand when it comes to DACA. I'm going to go ahead and have you go to the next slide if you can. All right, so that's when I said DACA, the legal precarity of it is that the legal roller coaster of DACA. In 2012, it was an executive action. In 2017, Trump and former President Trump ends DACA and gives Congress 6 months to create a legislative fix. Politics aside, when it's an executive action, anyone can take that away. So obviously that happened in 2017. And then 2020, US Supreme Court declares that DACA should be restored. And it did happen to come back. The Trump administration 2020 reinstates DACA, or reduces it from 2 years to 1 year. So I would have to renew it almost constantly to make sure that I stay in this country. And that's where your fear comes in of, oh goodness, like, what am I supposed to do the next year if it actually does not go through? And then in 2021, President Biden fully restores DACA from 1 year to 2 year status, and new applications resume being accepted. When a DACA recipient sends an application out, it does not mean that they're going to get it right away. We have to wait until immigration sends us back a document saying your next step. And that's not enough, because if you are employed, I was employed at a bank and mine was coming to expire soon. I had done my biometrics, I had done the steps, but I'm still waiting for a final answer. And my employer let me know, we might have to let you go if you do not have that permit by this date. And that's, you start to fear comes in your mind. So then July 16, 2021, the federal judge declares that DACA is illegal, and the Department of Homeland Security stops accepting new applications, but continues to renew former applicants. And then on September 28, 2021, DHS publishes a proposed rule that would preserve and fortify DACA, but change the work permit requirements. They give the public 60 days to comment, and President Biden has pledged to appeal and continue to urge Congress to pass a permanent legislation for Dreamers. At this moment, there's nothing in regards to permanent legislation for Dreamers. So that is the update in that sense today. And then if you could move on to the next slide. All right, so on the left, it talks about policies to protect vulnerable students. This is something that has been used by Stanford Law School, to be exact, and it shows enrollment, confidentiality, law enforcement on campus, family preparedness. You will be receiving this PowerPoint, but just for the sake of time, I want to make sure I go through the other graphs here. So the big thing that we talk about when it talks about confidentiality and the risk of exposure is that we are afraid to tell people what our immigration status is. I went through high school knowing my immigration status. Some of the adults know my immigration status, but my best friend didn't know my immigration status, and I didn't know hers. And until the very last week of high school, I was in class and everyone's celebrating for college and stuff. And I remember someone asking me, "Hey, why you chose a technical college?" And I said, "Hey, I'm a DACA student." And then that was the first time they had heard about it and had educated them about it. And it was the first time I had revealed my status to a classmate, someone of my age. And it was terrifying because they saw me differently and they realized, oh, wow, so that's why you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. With that being said, there's a graph here that says these barriers leave students with serious anxiety. Share of population that reported elevated levels of anxiety above the clinical cutoff level. So if you notice, a general male, 4%, male that's undocumented, 28.5%, for female, 9%. And then you see, obviously, for undocumented students, how higher it is. We tend to feel isolated. Like I said before, it's not just the college experience that I want, it's just the experience of being able to make decisions in my life that don't surround my immigration status. Becoming a mom, dating, all of these things, I had to realize like, oh my goodness, my status, how will they react? And then I know that last but not least, we have a graph that talks about the percentage of respondents in regards to how anxious they feel to certain questions. And the highest one is, does the possibility of the DACA program ending make you anxious? And that's the highest one, even though there's questions like, how anxious are you about the pandemic? The highest one was if DACA were to be taken away. So that is what I have here. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Alex.
Yeah, and I just want to add, right, with that, I think for me it was really startling to understand that even, this data that was collected for this graph on the bottom here, right, it was collected in the middle, the high point of the pandemic. And I know for many of us, right, that might have been the most anxiety inducing event of our entire lives. And to think that it was only half as anxiety inducing as the possible end of the DACA program, for me really blew my mind as somebody who is, right, familiar with the undocumented and documented student experience, but has never lived it. I have lived through the pandemic. It did put it into perspective for me in a new way. So the next impact that we kind of want to discuss is the idea of intersectionality. So, we're privileged to be here at an institution of higher education. And I think many of us will be familiar with this term, but to give you a very bad and very overly simplified explanation, right? Intersectionality is the way that the different identities that you hold come together to impact your lived experiences and interact with one another. So a couple of statistics that we can keep in mind as we work with undocumented students is that not all of their experiences are the same and that they are deeply impacted by other identities that they might hold. So for example, Black undocumented immigrants face deportation 40% more than the undocumented population as a whole. As of 2016, right? So that's saying, right, race matters as well. The trend of over-policing and hyper-policing and hyper-criminalization, it exists in deportation as well. There's question of English language, right? Katie was talked about this in her experiences, but as of 2016, only 34% of undocumented immigrants over the age of 18 were proficient in English, right? And I know that Alverno, we'll talk about this, has ALL programs and ESL programs that are designed to help bridge this gap, right? But it's another thing to think about. There's a question of class and poverty, right? Almost half of undocumented immigrants in California are below the poverty line. And we use California as an example because not just because they have the best data, because they have the policies that are most supportive of undocumented folk. And so if California is sitting at 44%, imagine what it is in a place like Wisconsin. And then finally, although undocumented immigrants account for less than 3% of the LGBTQ plus population in the US, they represent 8% of hate violence survivors from that group, right? And so they are hyper vulnerable based on not just on their sexuality, but on the combination of their sexuality and their status. And it makes sense, right? Because what do you do when you need to call the authorities because of an issue of hate, but you know that the authorities might come and deport you instead, right? And so this is just a reminder for us, right, to think about that the undocumented students that we serve, that attend our institutions, they're not just their status, right? They have all these other things that interact with their status in really complex ways. So, I think the question then is, knowing what these struggles are, knowing what these barriers are, what does a supportive environment for undocumented students look and feel like? And I think one of the things that we can do is anticipate moments of vulnerability. So for the sake of time, we're going to breeze through these. And again, you can look at these, but I think it's just an idea that, right, like the timeline that we think of, and we can think about in the context of an academic year, where we know that students will struggle around midterms or around finals, right? Or students might struggle when things start to get cold, or students will have a hard time adjusting to the campus when they first come, right? We kind of have those rhythms of academic life in our head. And this is just to point out that for undocumented students, those rhythms and those timelines can look different. And times that are supposed to be moments of celebration, right? Internships, nursing or education, clinicals, right? Student teaching, post-graduation, right? So for a lot of undocumented and documented students, these are times that their status really hurts them the most, right? Because this moment of celebration for their peers is transformed into something else. So at Alverno College, there are many different resources. So Alverno College does commit to supporting DACA and undocumented students, right? That's on the website. That's a part of the mission of the university. And I think evidence, right? We're here, we're together. So I think I would say that that is probably true, right? So what does that look like in practice? Well, Alverno will not share immigration status with authorities unless compelled to do so as a result of a warrant. This, in some ways, right, this might seem like the bare minimum, but there are many universities who will go out of their way to share status information with any authority they can find who will listen. Additionally, and this applies to everybody in this room, I believe, college faculty and staff, including campus security officers, will not and should not inquire about or record students' immigration status while performing their responsibility. Right. So if you're ever in a position where you feel like you're being asked to do this, you feel like you have to do this, right? According to Alverno College's own statements, own missions, that's not the case, right? You should not ever have to do that, nor should you. And then finally, Alverno College will continue to admit and award financial aid to DACA and undocumented students, right? And so again, we're talking about institutional aid here. And so I think, right, this is a reminder for us that we know that there will be undocumented and documented students in the student body of Alverno, right? As a result of these promises, as a result of these commitments. So this is just to talk a little bit more about the institutional aid, so you have an idea of what that actually looks like for a student who's applying. So Alverno offers this aid to undocumented and documented students. Once they complete their application, they have to submit an additional form and return it to the financial aid office, okay? The form is listed on here. You can also find it online. You can also contact the financial aid office and they have experts ready to help. Other forms of support, like I said, DACA students, documented students are eligible to work on campus, but undocumented students are not. And there is an Eleanor Roosevelt scholarship that Alverno encourages undocumented and documented students to apply for. But unfortunately, and it's a full tuition scholarship and it's an awesome opportunity, but it is only awarded to one student per year, right? So it's an opportunity, but it's a hyper competitive opportunity that may not be realistic for every student. These are additional resources. We'll go relatively quickly. All this information is taken from Alverno's website. So if there's something specific you need to learn more about, you're able to do that. So the Dean of Students office, right? They're there to advocate for students and specifically serve as allies for them. And they're also, the place that's really supposed to help build the type of community that could be supportive of undocumented students in every walk of life. counseling and health services, right? We've already touched on the mental health challenges that come with having undocumented or documented status. They offer crisis help, short-term counseling, and then also referrals for long-range treatment for those who need more intensive services. Campus ministry, right? We know that Alverno is very proud of its roots and its ongoing missions. So they offer guidance. And I think oftentimes, right, we got to remember that religious identity impacts our students too. And so for some undocumented and documented students, this is the place that they will turn. And also, I should note that there is a such thing as, right, like legal privilege when you are, talking with clergymen. And so there's actually a legal protection there that can make students feel more at ease going to those sorts of services. There's also the International and Intercultural Center. I actually think I saw somebody in this meeting who had that listed on their Zoom name. So hello, I'm talking about you. They offer a ton of different opportunities to really help students embrace diverse cultures. However, one thing that I want to note is that for undocumented and documented students, studying abroad is effectively impossible. Now, DACA students can, in theory, apply for a permit to leave the country and then come back, but it is almost never approved. And when I say almost never, I mean like there were 2 approved in 2021 with a sympathetic administration. So it's really unlikely. There is also,
Hey, Alex, can
Yeah.
I jump in? So this is Elena. I do work in the International Intercultural Center. I do work with study abroad, and you are right. But I would say that for anybody who is interested in finding domestic opportunities for students and putting together things that are maybe an experience, but not necessarily requiring people to leave the US, I would be more than happy to work with people so that we can provide those opportunities to students, even if it is a little bit different than what other students with documentation are able to do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for chiming in. And actually, that's a really good point I should have said at the beginning. There are really good faculty and staff that work at all of these different initiatives, right? If you have questions about what they do, they will be able to answer those way better than Katie and I can. So I would really encourage you, right? If you see something where you're like, I'd like to know more about this, reach out to those programs, right? That's what they're there for. We're coming together as a community here at Alverno, right? Let's use those connections to help make a difference. And so the last couple of things, right? We have diversity, equity, and inclusion here at Alverno. And this, again, they offer special events, resource links, and I think also, perhaps most importantly, that's where you can find incidents of bias and hate, where you can actually report that. ESL program here. One of the things that Alverno does that I personally think is really cool is offer individual sessions with a program coordinator to help support students in the ways that they specifically need. And so this support is relatively holistic, right? Through classes, one-on-one assistance, tutoring, conversation partners, all of that good stuff. And then finally, Youth Empowered in the Struggle, or YES. It's a student group here on campus, and we will actually end this training by talking about for what they want to see on campus. One of the things they do that's really cool to kind of bridge the gap between high school and college is offer active mentorship in the community. And I think oftentimes if you're unsure of what an initiative in your department would look like that would serve undocumented students, this student group can be an excellent place to start. I will turn it over to Katie, and just as a heads up, we will take a quick break after these resources. Katie will talk about existing resources in Wisconsin.
Yes, and for the sake of time again, I'm going to make sure I am highlighting these places. So we're going to talk about the understanding existing resources in Wisconsin. So this is very important. There are places like Voces de la Frontera. I would definitely like to highlight, because this is a group within Alverno, which is the YES, which Alex just mentioned, Youth Empowered in the Struggle. They are the youth arm of the organization, and you have it in Alverno, so that's great. And we also have Catholic Charities Services for Immigrants, Archdiocese of Milwaukee. Did want to also mention that these places that I'm talking about, they have social media. If you want to know more of what the work they do, and if you like social media, it can be from Facebook. They have Facebook, they have Instagram. If you want to get involved, We're open to resources and also getting involved. They always need volunteers. You can go to the next slide, Alex. And then there's Dreamers of Wisconsin, which is the nonprofit that I represent and Alex and I represent. And we have Centro Hispano of Dane County, and we have Center for Dreamers at UW-Madison. When we mention these places, they are in Wisconsin, but be aware that a lot of undocumented and documented students might not know of these places, even though I said they're in Wisconsin. Some of them are primarily in the Dane County area. I was from southeastern Wisconsin and from Kenosha, and I didn't really know many of these locations because I was very like close-minded, and I was too afraid that when they say Dane County, UW-Madison, they only focused on that area. They do not. They actually try to help you from wherever you are in Wisconsin. So I do want to highlight that even though in their name it says at UW-Madison, it is meant for anyone in Wisconsin. So on to the next step. And again, you will receive the PowerPoint and you'll see the resources. You'll see the name again. And if you have questions, please let me know. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and do activity 2, which is practicing effective mentoring for undocumented students. Alex, did you want to handle how this will work, like the instruction?
Yeah. Let's take a quick break first, Katie. Let's do a quick break. All right, we're gonna take a break out of respect for the fact we've been sitting for almost 2 hours. We appreciate you bearing with us. We'll come back together at 3 p.m. I would recommend not leaving the Zoom call, but turn off your camera, you can mute yourself, and we'll come back together at 3. So in about 6 minutes to go to the next step and our next activity, okay? Thank you.
All right, okay, so we're gonna go ahead and give you guys the instructions for these scenarios. So these scenarios are meant to kind of have you as a group. We're gonna put you in breakout rooms, talk through these situations and see what would be the best practices. And when determining your answer, you might want to think of what role you have in Alverno and seek your strengths and weaknesses. You will spend some time with your group discussing this, and I believe we will be announcing the scenarios for the sake of time. So I'll go ahead and ask Rachel if she can please. And I think Alex actually sent out to everyone here the scenario number 1. So you do have it as well here in the chat. So we can start doing the breakout rooms.
We should actually, was a little bit scuffed. It was hard to distribute the scenarios. We do have additional things for you to think about, additional scenarios you can access in the slides. But for the sake of time and because of our technological limitations, we are going to move on. And Katie's going to talk a little bit about some general best practices.
Yes, so the best practices, let's touch base on engage with an open mind. When supporting undocumented students, it is important to know that there won't be a single answer or path for all students. Support requires ongoing investigation and collaboration with other service providers and community leaders, like the resources we provided, Voces de la Frontera, Dreamers of Wisconsin, like you are doing today. Also, create a safe space. Don't ask undocumented students to self-identify. Make resources easily available for all students. Understand that trust takes time. Be mindful of your language. Say undocumented rather than illegal, and avoid terms like alien or illegal immigration. Do all you can to identify yourself as an ally supporter, if that is what you identify as. And I'll talk about it, why it's important. There's ways to show and demonstrate that you are an ally, a supporter. You use posters, bookmarks, stickers to make your support visible. However, the moment you decide to put a sticker up saying we're welcoming dreamers, please be prepared, because I had an experience myself. I went to a university that 5 minutes away from my home. I saw so many stickers. I loved it, saying dreamers welcome, 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 dreamers are welcome. And I walk into a room that says dreamers are welcome. And I asked, hey, do you have resources for dreamers? And I was told, what is that? And I remember saying, you guys have dreamers are welcome, you have bookmarks. you don't know what Dreamers is? And they're like, no, but you can go to like a counselor to if you need more resources or information. And I remember leaving that room, a slap in my face, like, why am I welcome? Why does it say I'm welcomed if they don't know who like what I'm going through? And I'm like, that's fine. Maybe that individual doesn't know, and that's okay. I go to the individual who is the counselor, and she gives me resources, and she tells me, and I hope it was lighthearted. She said, you chose the wrong state to get an education in. And I left that room not feeling supported. I felt like all these stickers were just a joke. And I remember walking down the hallways with a bitter taste in my mouth of what are these welcome signs if none of these individuals understand or want to support. And if they do, they're not doing it adequately. So the third one is understand admissions and enrollment practices for undocumented students. There's resources that Alverno has provided. Understand in-state tuition and state-based aid requirements for undocumented students. Try to stay up to date on the status of deferred action for childhood arrival. I know it's a lot of information, but just pick or choose certain nonprofits or places that you feel you would want to get your information from, just to further understand. Number 4 is find and advocate for scholarships and financial support. Keep track of scholarships that don't require citizenship or residency. It is important because, like I said before, there's places the university I went to, they gave me a lot of resources, they gave me a lot of scholarships, but they were all scholarships from California. So I couldn't even be able to apply for them. 5, build your own educator network. Today, you have a community. There are so many individuals that are present in this training that you can connect. You probably already know them. You have not. This is a great moment to build that relationship. Also, number 6 is build agency and power. That is what you're doing today. And that is what clubs like Yes is doing for students like me. And then number 7, create spaces for storytelling and creative expression. Encourage students to build their own meaning and identity that is different from the negative stigma and stereotypes about undocumented immigrants. And that honestly is something I wanted to bring up. One thing before we go to the next thing, do not assume that you know what it means to be undocumented. They may not want you to do anything as much as they need information or referral. The student may just want you to know that they are not slackers. For example, they may want you to know that they simply do not have the financial resources or the ability to travel by car or travel abroad. That is why these scenarios were present. You'll receive the PowerPoint. You'll be able to go through the scenarios. We had 5 scenarios in total, so I do apologize again that we didn't give you enough time. But it is significant that you take these practices and take them and actually acknowledge if you're an ally, which I'm going to hand it over to Alex, who will speak on that.
All right, everybody. So a little bit more about who I am, right? So I was born and raised in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and I had never met an undocumented person or a documented person until I was 19 and in college. And I had an experience in one of my first years at UW-Madison that convinced me that there needed to be something different, right? With our society, with our state, with our community. And that's when I really started to look into what does it mean to be an ally? And so for me, right, this experience was working as a tutor in charge of a site of students, an after school site at one of the local high schools in Madison. And this was back when ICE was doing raids in the Madison community in Dane County. And there was a car, a police car with big ICE letters on the side that was just doing laps around the school, through the parking lot, across the road, just doing laps for like an hour. And I learned that day, right, that there were students in that classroom who they themselves were not undocumented or documented because of the restrictions of the program I was working for, but who had parents and siblings and loved ones who were terrified of this. I mean, truly terrified, right? And I think, for somebody who suddenly found themselves at a relatively young age in a position of responsibility to try and comfort and support students in this scenario, right? In a scenario that I truly cannot even imagine, it convinced me something needed to change. And so for me, right, that's kind of my into this sort of work of being an ally for undocumented and documented students. So what is an ally, right? An ally is somebody who acknowledges the right of undocumented students to be enrolled in a college, right? They are somebody who educates themselves about the rights afforded by law to documented and undocumented students so that they're able to give good advice, right? Accurate advice, so that they're able to understand what students are going through. There are people who find alternative ways to assist students to meet all of their different goals, even when they're excluded by law from regular participation. And so what this is saying is not right that we're telling you to go out and do something that violates a law, right? And we understand and respect how much work all of you have to put in your positions already, right? But what this is a reminder that an ally is somebody who is committed to taking those extra steps, going that extra mile in the ways that they can. And then lastly, right, an ally is somebody who listens openly and is accessible, but doesn't push students beyond their comfort level. And what is key here is the idea of maintaining confidentiality, right? So when I say this, I mean, this extends to, like, you don't come home, someone discloses their status to you, you don't come home and tell your significant other, you don't tell your partner, you don't tell your parents, you don't tell other people at the university, right? It's really keeping this confidentiality as kind of almost a sacred sort of secret. Now, we did have a question earlier coming out of the scenarios, right, about what happens if you're compelled by law to disclose a status for somebody, right? And I would say the only time that would happen would be when there is another legal matter in play, right? When there's an investigation for something else, right? So if there's been a crime committed, something like that, in that case, you might be legally compelled to do so. And I think that's kind of a gray area, right? I'm not going to sit up here and tell you that you can't be an ally if you're not willing to go to jail for violating the subpoena, right? That's not the case, right? There are gradations of allyship, and if you were ever to find yourself in such an extreme scenario like that, you'll have to make the decision for yourself. As I go through these slides talking about what it means to be an ally, there's going to be a series of reflection questions, and I just want you to think about those kind of in the back of your mind as we go through. So for this first one, right, it's really important that allies are clear about their personal motivations, right? Clear about what it means, clear about why you're interested in supporting students, right? Because a lot of times undocumented and documented students are not used to people trying to be supportive, right? It can feel like there's an ulterior motive. And so I think it's important that you understand why you're committed to this sort of work, why you're committed to allyship. Because if you don't know, how can you ever expect a student to trust you, right? So there are 4 basic levels to becoming an ally, and which I want y'all to think about here is, like, which of these levels do you think will be the most challenging for you? Think about your own strengths and your own weaknesses, right? What are the things that'll come easier, and what are the things that'll be a little bit harder? So first, there's awareness, right? This is understanding that some of the students you serve will be undocumented or documented. It's attending training sessions like this one today, educating yourself on the resources, paying attention to current events pertaining to immigration. All of you who are listening to me right now are in this training. So congratulations, you're well on your way to becoming an ally. You've completed at least a little bit that first step, right? And what I do want to point out is that these steps aren't linear, right? You don't just educate yourself once and then you get to stop learning, right? I think as people who have come together in the context of higher education, we know that it's important to be lifelong learners, right? And that applies to being an ally in many different ways. Secondly, right, there's a question of knowledge. So it's not just awareness, it's understanding what students are experiencing. And I think more importantly, right, one of the things that come as you know more and more about undocumented and documented student experiences is the understanding that there are things that you don't know, right? That you don't actually know, even if you have the most knowledgeable person in the world on these things. You haven't actually experienced that yourself, right? And understanding the difference between that knowledge and the things you can know and the things that you can't know, right, is really, really important to, I think, effective allyship. Next, there's the skills, right? Things like thinking through those scenarios. How do you how do you prepare yourself so that when something comes up, you're able to implement those skills, implement your knowledge in a way that can actually support students. And then finally, and I know I'm moving a little bit fast, but just for the sake of time, action, actually doing these things, being intentional about seeking out opportunities to put these things into practice, being open about what you're scared to do, and sometimes challenging yourself to do extra things. And then lastly, right, approach all of these situations with a deep emphasis on cultural humility, on the understanding that you are not somebody who has every single insight, no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how empathetic you are, no matter how much you care, right? There will always be things that you don't understand. And having that humility as you go through these actions is the sort of thing that I think will ultimately render your allyship the most impactful. It is worth talking about what the risks of allyship are, right? I'm not going to pretend like allyship is something that is always going to be fun, always going to be easy, right? I think in today's day and age, oftentimes there's actually a social capital that comes with being an ally, right? There are people in the community who will look at you and respect you and say, hey, it's really cool that you fight for this. And that is a reason that people are allies, right? But also, I think there are also real risks. So, for example, right, becoming the subject of gossip or rumors, feeling a certain feeling of alienation, right? And maybe, right, we had over 100 people come to this training. So maybe at Alverno, that's not necessarily the place you feel this, right? But for me, I lived in Madison for a long time. When I go home for holidays, I spend time with my grandparents who are from Kiel, Wisconsin, and the rural part of Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. They way out there. And you feel real alienation when you talk about things like immigration, when you have those difficult conversations. That's always been true for me, and I'm sure it'll be true for many of you. Your patriotism, politics, morality, they might all be called into question, and others might speculate on your motivation. They might say exactly what I said earlier, right? What's in it for you? Why does this person care? Are they motivated by selfish reasons, or is it something else? And then lastly, I think allyship can be a thankless job, right? And I mean that because there are times where no matter how hard you try, no matter what you do, you will not be able to have the desired impact that you want to have. I have a professor that I've had the privilege to work with who works on asylum cases. And he told me that the hardest part of that job, acting as an expert witness that argues for people to be able to stay in the United States, is the fact that he knows that in about 75% of all the cases he works with, those people will be deported, right? And I know that in general, allyship doesn't necessarily have that stakes that are that high in every single moment, right? But understanding that there are times where being an ally will lead to really difficult situations is important. It's what renders allyship sustainable. The question then, right, what are the goals of allyship? What are the benefits of allyship? And I really like, I think this is where I want to ask you all to think, right? What is the goal of your allyship? What do you want to see happen here at Alverno, here on campus? How do you measure your progress towards that goal? This image that I point to down below, I actually didn't know what it was when I first saw it, but it's a graduation cap and gown that a Dreamer student had created to celebrate their graduation from college. And for me, right, working with undocumented and documented students in higher education, that's both the goal, but in other ways, it's also the starting point, right, towards a more equitable society. And so I think it's worth really spending the time to look at yourself in the mirror and say, what do I want? What do we want as a community? And the other benefits, right? You make a huge difference. You cultivate a diverse and just environment for everybody, not just some. You empower yourself to take a more active role in creating the type of campus and the campus climate that you want to see, right? We all talk about leadership as a huge buzzword, right? Well, this is a way where you can be a leader in a field that desperately, desperately needs it. And then finally, you're a role model to others. I think there is something really powerful about saying, when you work in higher education, no matter what your position is, there's a certain level of prestige and authority that comes with that, right? It varies from role to role, but that is always the case. You become a role model to the community, to students that you interact with, to other staff members who might just recently have joined the Alverno community. And I think that has the impact of pushing others to allyship. It's kind of like a snowball, right? It grows and it grows and it grows. So moving forward, with the question of effective ally strategies, right? I also want us to really think, and if we had more time, I would make us all write this down. I put on my teacher hat, really get in there. But I would encourage you, right? What are you going to do? What concrete actions will you take to become a more effective ally when this training is over? It can be things like reviewing the slides, having discussions with people in your department, encouraging others to check out the training. But what's ultimately important is that whatever you choose to do, you gotta actually do it, right? You have to make that commitment and follow through. So there's, effective ally strategies, right? You start by taking responsibility. I think in some ways, right, the fact that you're all here is taking that responsibility. Next, you have to understand your own limitations, right? You got to avoid giving advice or assistance that might actually negatively impact somebody. And a lot of times this isn't intentional, right? I'm sure pretty much all of you in this room say, I would never do that to a student, right? But I think sometimes, and where it's the most dangerous, is when you don't even know that you're doing it. Next, support, right? Look around at the initiatives that you can support. We talked about Youth Empowered in the Struggle, a youth organization here on campus, a student organization who actively is working for these sorts of causes, right? What would it mean to support them, right? What does it mean to support other people trying to be allies and do this work? Next, within the spirit of these requirements, become flexible about course and program requirements. Be understanding, look critically at the practices, the best practices that you all have, right? We talked in the chat a little bit about what could we include in the syllabus, right? Look at these best practices, things that are cemented, and see how you could change it to be more flexible so that you don't add these barriers. Next, and I think this is a really important one for us to remember, accept any gratitude you might receive, but don't expect it, right? If you're doing this, if you want to become an ally because you want somebody to, thank you, I got really bad news for you, right? I got really bad news for you. And I will say personally, right, as somebody who identifies as an ally, as somebody who, is from a demographic and is from a geographic area that doesn't always support this sort of thing, it is hard to humble yourself to understand that you will not get that thank you, but more importantly, that you do not deserve a thank you, right? And I think that that's really important for us to think through as people who want to be allies. And then lastly, right, employ self-awareness and self-reflection. Look in the mirror, take the time to really understand what your positionality is and who you are and who you can be as an ally. So I'll pass it over to Katie for our second to last section.
Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing your side of being an ally and how that has impacted your life and how you became an ally. So I did want to show this. This is the poster that some universities use to show, hey, dreamers are welcome. They are sometimes called safe zones. They have certain areas where you can go as a dreamer, that all the resources are there. Like I told you like I mentioned earlier, I had a bad experience with this welcoming poster because the individuals that had these posters in the university didn't know what it was about. And I want to take this time for you, staff and faculty, to think and reflect on what that safe zone looks like to you. Is it this poster? And then what does it mean? How would you introduce this safe zone to your classroom, to your office desk, wherever you are? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to walk step by step the education system with an undocumented student. It might mean that you end up talking to someone who isn't undocumented or a documented individual who doesn't know about this. You might accidentally or with purpose educate someone else on this topic. You all are in Alverno, but also you are in the community. So you have an extra piece of knowledge that you can bring to the community and resources. It doesn't not necessarily have to be only in Alverno. I'm just going to reiterate some things that I say just you should not say in these safe zones, which are you illegal? How did you get here? Tell me about your immigration status. So how do you live? Is your family illegal too? I can't believe they let an illegal in. There are no alternatives to my requirements. You chose the wrong state to get an education, and I feel sorry for you. These are things that I probably have heard of. I most likely did have heard of. And these are just some things that, as sad as it might be, hearing it from me, like I obviously should not say that. It makes people uncomfortable and so on. It still can happen. And it's okay if that's maybe language, the type of language you might have used, but because we are not aware of how our language can impact the conversation we have with these students. So definitely just be careful with it. And again, reflect on what that safe zone looks like and be prepared. To the next slide. I'll go ahead and show these are resources for post-graduation. I titled them with, you can click them when you receive this PowerPoint. It is titled to be focused on that topic. So life after college, a guide for undocumented students, income and career alternatives, creating fellowship programs, creating non-fellowship programs, working for yourself, starting as an independent contractor, navigating graduate school to undocumented students. Having these resources also like on your site is helpful, and other general tips that include, regardless, as an ally, as a DACA individual, always advise for seek legal assistance. Do not think that just because you saw this on the internet, oh, that's legal. That's like legal advice. Do not never give legal advice. Always tell them, hey, I know someone who can give you legal advice. I have resources that can give you legal advice. It's always important, and I encourage it to do provide that information during and after graduation so they can prepare for life after college. Network within your community or nationally. Again, different states have different guidelines. So I wish I was told when I was in elementary school that, hey, you can go to a different state. But I didn't know better. Now I know, and you have this information you can bring up to younger individuals that, hey, there are opportunities in other states. And also consider also network with your community or nationally, not just students, but yourself. Alverno can see what are the best practices other universities are doing and how they're moving forward and how you can implement it as well. And then last but not least, consider how to monetize passions and skills by building a business. I realized that what I could do is take my marketing degree and solidify it by having a digital marketing agency to assist local businesses. And that's how I've moved forward after post-graduation. All right, so we can go to the next. I believe I'll pass it back to Alex.
Yes, so we're on the concluding part of our presentation, and we will briefly conclude with a call to action and then have a short period of Q&A before the session's over and our time is up. So I think, right, when we think about what we're doing here, why should you care? Why should you be an ally? Why are you here, right? You don't have to look any further than the statement of mission for your own institution, for Alverno College, right? And I'm just going to read out the last part of this because I think it is so powerful, right? Inspired by its Catholic, Franciscan, and liberal arts heritage, the college intentionally creates an inclusive community that engages students in active and collaborative learning and fosters academic excellence. Our success is not measured in awards and recognitions. It's measured by changing the world one student at a time. Some of those students will be undocumented and documented. They are students who oftentimes need the support, who will change the world if they just have a little bit of extra help, a little bit of extra resources available to them. It is consistent, I think, with the mission of Alverno College to build the type of place that treasures, protects, and promotes and empowers undocumented and documented students. And I hope if this training has showed you anything, right, it is what that might actually look like and why it's so important that we do so. So finally, I just want to end with some concrete recommendations. And we are aware, right? We are aware that for many of you, some of these, you'll be in a position where it's like, that has nothing to do with me. I don't have any power to change that. And we get that, right? But as an overview, these were recommendations that we received from Alverno students for Alverno students, from what they would want to see to make campus a more inclusive and supportive place for undocumented students. So first, increase financial support through targeted scholarships and grants, right? We've already covered why there are so many issues with financial barriers to college, but specifically this includes guidance, right? Not just saying, oh, these things are out there, but offering one-on-one consultations for prospective students so that they can have clarity of vision of what opportunities are available to them. Additionally, offering extra guidance on how to file for institutional aid with clearer instructions for applicants who can't file a FAFSA. There are instructions present online, but they're difficult to find and they can be difficult to navigate through, right? Offering this additional guidance really will empower students. Next, provide informational meetings about how college works, available to prospective undocumented or documented students, and offering this information on the difference between DACA and undocumented status, right? Katie told us in her story that sometimes students don't even know that they have these statuses until much later in life, right? Offering these sorts of things that can clarify how their time at Alverno College will be impacted by their status, and their specific status is extremely important in allowing students to plan their future. Next, support and empower former or current documented and undocumented students to speak about their journey. In some ways, that's what Katie was able to do here today, right? But what would it look like to have that not from an outside organization, but from within your own community, right? Not to say we're not part of the community, right? Because of course we are. But somebody from Alverno, right? Alumni, students, people who are at the very core of the institution. Next, create a safe haven Hispanic center at Alverno where students can walk in and feel safe, as well as find resources. And specifically, right, there were mention of empowering the Career Studio to offer additional resources that are safe for undocumented students, and providing DACA clinics and other legal support services right there on campus through Alverno and its partners. And then the last two, right? These are things that I think we've already started to do, but these are things that every single person in the Zoom meeting right now can play a role in. One, train faculty and other university professionals on DACA and undocumented student experiences, right? That's what we're doing here today, but the work doesn't end here. How will you take what you've learned? How will you take the resources provided to you and expand them throughout the rest of your community? And then finally, remove the social stigma surrounding documented and undocumented individuals, right? The fact that students on campus would say this means that there is a stigma still in place. And I'm not singling out Alverno, right? Lord knows that every institution I've worked for has struggled with the exact same thing. But this is something that as individuals, we have to do, right? That I believe that we need to do to create the sort of environment that can really empower documented and undocumented students. So with that being said, we're going to move to the Q&A time, answering the questions that you've already submitted. But before we do, I just want to thank you all for your attention, and thank you so much for inviting us into your community to put on this training. It really has been a pleasure and a privilege to be here.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Alexander and Katie. I feel so inspired, so empowered to continue to do this kind of work at Alverno. So now we're going to go to, we have about 9 minutes. Let me look at the chat. So there's a question about Blaze. Could this be a Blaze referral, or is it better not to have this? Unfortunately, I am not faculty, so I don't know much about Blaze. Does someone want to?
I think I answered that in the chat.
Okay.
No, you should not put anything about a student's status in Blaze. I would say if you have a concern or a question about it, about a situation, you can actually come directly to me or Elena, and I could work with you to, and Stephanie also, but I would not put anything about a student's status in Blaze. As we talked about in Institute, I am actually developing some templates for faculty that could be very broad. So you could maybe put something in there that's like, a student shared some important information with me today. I'm sharing this with you. I'd like to follow up or something like that. But otherwise, don't put anything about anyone's status, because Blaze and all of those, like any kind of documentation, I don't even put it in. I would never put it in an email. If for example, if a student were asking, like, let's say they were in a major where they're going to have to do an internship or a clinical or something, and they were asking, and they disclosed to you, well, hey, I'm undocumented. How will I be able to do this? you can reach out to me, or you can reach out to Elena, and we can talk to you about some of the possibilities, but please don't put in an email. This student told me they were undocumented. Just say, I have a student who has questions about this. Can we talk? And I've had meetings with students and faculty to kind of talk about that. But I think one of the other things that came up too is like, you don't, like, if sometimes when a student tells you this, they're telling you not so that you will like they're telling you because they feel like you're a safe person, right? And so what I would do if I were you is ask them, say, this is something that is going to affect like your next semester. Would you feel comfortable if I reached out to someone else on campus who can help us with this situation? And then I do like what Meg and I like to call the warm handoff. Introduce them to us either by walking them to our office or reaching out via email or something like that, and not just saying, oh, they're in this office, go visit them. I hope that helps. I didn't mean to take over there, but I think that kind of.
Katie, Alex, do you have any comments on that?
I would say in regards to the Blaze comment, everything that Rachel said was correct and appropriate. Another thing is, surprisingly, I've had universities ask me, why don't we just like check how many undocumented individuals are? Some people, a majority of people will not self-report. They will not, because they've heard horror stories, their parents telling them, if you self-report, we're gonna all get deported. So I would definitely say, if they themselves won't do it, then like they said, have that confidentiality, or at least the warm handoff is really great, and it helps them feel like, okay, there's a community. If this person talks to that individual and they bring me to them, I feel more comfort in that. That's all I have to say.
Karina, you can unmute yourself. I see your hand raised.
Okay, I had a question in the chat.
Okay.
So I was trying to find my question again so I wouldn't lose my own words. Is Wisconsin developing legislation that supports DACA and undocumented students or persons? And if so, what are those initiatives? And how are they being introduced by? And how do we support those people and those initiatives?
So one of the things that we have done recently through Dreamers is create a few different policy briefs and advocate for undocumented students around the issue of in-state tuition, right? Like I said earlier in the training, Wisconsin used to offer in-state tuition for undocumented students who met certain criteria, and now we no longer do, even as most other states around the country have pivoted to offer in-state tuition. So that's one of, in my mind, one of the major ways that we're trying to work through the legislative system to help support undocumented students in higher education. But to be honest with you, the landscape is often pretty bleak, right? And that's not just because we've had unsympathetic political leadership, but also because there is a high political cost in the state of Wisconsin still to supporting legislation that benefits undocumented or documented students. Now, in the most recent budget that was released by our current governor, he did include one of his priorities being offering more equitable access for undocumented and documented. But there hasn't really been any tangible action. So kind of the landscape at the current moment looks like organization like ours, like many of the other groups that do really great work, lobbying and trying to conduct grassroots movements in support of that sort of legislation. The last major bill that was introduced was in 2016, and it was shot down pretty decidedly. So we are still a long ways from that sort of thing. As for the other part of the question, right, what can you do to support it? I think really it's just educating yourself, being aware of current events and how they're going to impact the community. And then more than that, right, looking for opportunities to support organizations and candidates that align with your beliefs. We are a nonprofit organization. We are not political. So I will not tell you who to vote for. That is a decision that you all need to make for your own. But I think from an institutional standpoint, right, we as Dreamers of Wisconsin are trying to do that sort of work along with many others beside us. But we're still in many ways in the early stages of that.
Alexander and Katie, where can we find information on Dreamers of Wisconsin?
Yes, so you can find more information on Dreamers of Wisconsin in dreamersofwisconsin.com. I'll send it out there. Just know we're going through some updates in our website. So if it doesn't come up for you this week, it is just a few updates. So Dreamers of Wisconsin. Oh, sorry. Dreamers of Wisconsin is, I'm just sending it out. Yeah, so Dreamers of Wisconsin. And I know that part of a conversation that we've had with Stephanie is that you will have a point of contact within the nonprofit to assist you and hopefully continue the education of DACA and undocumented students within Alverno.
Does anybody else have more questions? You can unmute yourself or ask in the chat. Might be missing something.
Actually, Stephanie, we have a couple through the form.
Okay,
That will be really short to answer if we can just do
Okay.
it real quick.
go ahead and do it.
So one question was about asylum, seeking asylum. So when you come to the United States seeking asylum, you're undocumented until your asylum status is approved, right? So once your asylum status is approved, everything changes, but you are initially considered undocumented and generally detained as your application for asylum is considered. So that was one question we got, right? How does asylum seeker fit into all this? That's the answer. And then Katie will answer quickly. There was a question about, do you need work permits to be able to attend college?
You need money to go and get an education. So you would want a work permit to get an education. However, there are a lot of individuals that are undocumented working. We have, there's places that will allow undocumented people to work in their businesses. And that is, they won't have a work permit, so they can still go to get an education. So you don't need a work permit. Work permit is not asked from these students when they decide to go to college. So undocumented or DACA, you can go to college without or with a work permit. There's another question by Nat, I believe, Nat.
Yeah, I think, Nat, if you give us 1 second, I saw somebody else unmute right before I started talking, and we'll get to you next. I believe it was Judine, if I'm saying your name correctly. Did you have a question?
It was perfect. Thanks for a great day. And Katie just answered it. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, Nat, sorry about that. Thank you for your patience. What do you have for us?
No problem. It's actually been answered already, but I think it's a really important thing for us, for everyone on campus to know. Rachel answered this already. This is a question I put before, which is, what do we do if we get law enforcement or anyone who seems kind of official in any way asking for a student's immigration status, and they wave a piece of paper at us or whatever and say, this is a warrant? And Rachel answered it very clearly. Send them to campus safety. Don't talk to them. We are not qualified. Campus safety knows what to do, and it's appropriate to send them there. So just, that's just one thing I wanted to make sure everyone got that, because I think it's really important that we take the right action in that immediate moment where a student might actually be in danger. The college is protected, but the student's protected too. So thanks to Rachel for answering that specifically for our campus.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Nat, for reiterating that. That's very important to know. Any more questions?
Well, we want to be mindful of everyone's time. I know it's a Friday, so everyone has family time to get to and other things to do, eat dinner. But again, thank you everyone for participating in this training and everyone who played a part in making this happen. Rachel, Elena, Julie, and everyone who funded this training. And actually, all of this money goes to Dreamers of Wisconsin that supports students who are undocumented, documented with scholarships and programming and mentorship opportunities. So this training is well invested. It's going back to students. So again, I want to do a call to action. Want everyone to continue to have conversations within your own departments. What will you do today to become more effective allies, if that's what you're deciding to do? What you're considering in the next month, this semester, this academic year. And really, I'm pushing, I hope everyone advocates for these students and brings them out of, all the silencing from all these years. So yeah, that's what I want to end with. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening. Does anybody want to say more last words, Katie?
I just want to give a quick pitch. Thank you, Stephanie, so much. If anybody is particularly interested in this topic and would be interested in joining the DACA Undocumented Student Resource Subcommittee of our HSI committee, please reach out to me. And also, I know that Student Activities is hosting a loteria night and taco tasting. So if anyone is on campus and wants to join, I know all are welcome. So thank you so much.
One last thing, good point you make. So we will keep track of everyone who registered and actually participated. So please be on the lookout for next steps, whether a post training survey, and we will keep you all informed with everything that we're doing with the subcommittee in support of undocumented DACA students at Alverno. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, bye-bye.
Bye.